Greetings, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. We are so excited to be back once again, and we have enjoyed over the recent months talking with special friends and kind of communicating more about our podcast and kind of our whole style of engaging and bridge building and showing interfaith engagement, respecting, and kind of engaging within our local culture here as an evangelical ministry and as a team that is committed to building bridges with our LDS neighbors and friends. We have a very cool program today. We always like to say up front, if you would be willing and you feel like this podcast and the theme of this podcast to try to help people who have different opinions about important things engage one another in dialogue and conversation and with respect and love, as opposed to arguments and contentions. If you believe in that and like that and you find this valuable, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and to our podcast channel, wherever you pick it up. Please also share it with other people and comment. If you comment on it, that even gives us better markings with YouTube and whatnot. So even subscribe with the notification bell. So all that helps us to expand our audience and get more and more people to be a part of the Building Bridges movement, Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. And so we would really, really appreciate that and welcome your feedback, positive and negative. We try to respond to those things, and you have an open forum in the conversation box under the YouTube channel. And of course, when you're listening on Apple iPod, or oh my goodness, what are the different channels through wherever you listen to your podcast? We're there. I think we're there. So anyways, so right now I want to introduce my co-host, Jill, my wife, and just ask if you want to bring a greeting today before we begin.
Hi, it's great to be with you again. I'm really excited about this podcast because we have some good friends and very intelligent minds with us today.
Well, that's right. We are welcoming today two scholars from Brigham Young University in the religion faculty, and we're very excited to share with them and engage them in a conversation about something that we partner with and have been partnering with for a number of years, and that's an exchange program between evangelical college students from different parts of the country who come to Utah during spring break and engage with BYU students as well as Institute of Religion students all along the Wasatch Front. And we've been doing it for a number of years, but let me introduce them and give them a chance to introduce themselves a little bit. Dr. Andy Reed from BYU and Mike MacKay from BYU. I think you're both in church history, right?
We are.
Both church history area. So why don't you, Andy, start off and tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, your background, and just kind of introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. I'm Andy Reed. I'm an associate professor of church history and doctrine. I teach the world religions courses at Brigham Young University. And I am trained in some ways to work in the area of Jewish and Christian relations primarily. So that's sort of my initial interfaith interest. And for the past 4.5 years, I've been the faculty advisor for the Student Interfaith Club on campus. And so that's been one of the great pleasures of my work at BYU.
Fantastic. All right, Mike.
So, Mike MacKay, I started as a historian. I ended up at the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and so I've done quite a bit of work on the papers. From there, I joined the Department of Church History and Doctrine, and there I've taught history of Joseph Smith, foundations of the Restoration, and I now teach world religions. And so just recently I've joined Andy in the group that do interfaith work at BYU.
Yeah. Well, awesome. And we had the great privilege, Jill and I, of hosting you and your wife and 5 kids at a kind of a multicultural church in the Kearns area yesterday when we were together at Pastor Corey Hodges' church, The Point. And was the conversation last night before you went to bed? Did you guys kind of think about that as a family, or what were the kids thinking?
Yeah, that was it was a wonderful experience for my family. Going and participating in the kids. This is the first time they've wandered out and gone to another church, and so. Especially like my older son, he's pretty race conscious as an Asian American, and he he expressed, he said, well, it was kind of nice to see a congregation that came together ethnically or racially that was, and for him, he found a lot of comfort in that. He thought that was something nice. And so he commented about that last night, and he was kind of excited about the possibility of understanding how other people find God, and he saw some differences and some similarities, and overall it was a really positive experience. We have a 6-year-old, and the oldest is a 15-year-old, so there's 5 kids that are and some of them were like a little bit confused what it really was, but they're pretty young. Yeah. But I think at our nightly prayers, the youngest prayed that we'd be able to go back to that church. So, that's a positive experience for them. Yeah. So thanks for inviting us.
Well, I'm sure that June's prayer can be answered very easily. You just come on back, as Pastor Corey said. Visit anytime. And he was thrilled that you made the gesture of putting him on some kind of a recommendation list for some of your students at BYU as they are engaged in visiting other congregations as part of their study.
Yeah, part of the world religions experience is it's not just learning what people think or what they believe. It's learning how they behave, how they find God in their lives. And so a lot of times assignments will be to go out and figure out what that's like, go to a congregation. And so the Point Church is a great example of diversity in Utah, and we're hoping to see students to be able to experience that diversity. And so in some ways, that's why I was asking Pastor Corey, is this a space that our students would be welcome? And he was very excited about that possibility.
Yeah. Well, one quick thing about the Point Church, and we love Pastor Corey. He's a dear friend and very involved in our efforts with standing together. One of the things that's been really intentional on his behalf as a spiritual leader, faith leader in our community, is that he had to deliberately decide, as an African-American pastor, to move his church out of being a traditional black church with black culture and worship music and style, even down from wearing suits and ties every Sunday to more of a casual look, and deformalizing the church service, because he felt it would be really valuable to have a church that is made up of Hispanics and Asians and white folks and black folks and brown folks, and you really do see that when you go there. It doesn't feel like just an African-American church. And that's because Corey is very intentional about seeing the beauty and the splendor of the diversity of God's creation, and we see that in creation, but we see that in humanity. And instead of letting that be a point of division and tearing us apart, it really should be a place where we gather and celebrate with one another all that God has done to make the diversity of our ethnicities and our cultures and our background. And it's interesting, I said this to you yesterday, Mike, that like when we go overseas, we visit Europe, we go to Africa, we go to India, we kind of like, we're going to learn about their culture. It's going to be so cool. It's going to be, we went and had this kind of dinner, and we did this kind of experience, and we went to this tribal thing and this experience, and we kind of enjoy it when we go there. But then we come back and we want to come back to our own little ethnocentric world, where it all looks like us and feels like us and we don't want to be put out of that comfort zone. And I think what Pastor Corey's trying to do is say, hey, this shouldn't be outside of our comfort zone. The body of Christ is one and all. Yeah. So.
I think that's what's so powerful about these student dialogues that we're doing, because it gets us out of the comfort of our own culture, what we're used to, and it gets us into another culture and to realize, wow, we have some similarities and we have some differences too, and it helps us, I think, to grow closer to God. Since we're all made in the image of God, it really helps us to see a bigger picture of who God is. Andy, I'd love to hear from you just about, you've been doing this a little bit longer than Mike has, but just how you've seen the student dialogue maybe evolve or change, maybe some of the things that you'd like to see in the future as well.
And maybe just real quick to kind of explain it from your perspective as a BYU faculty, what is the student dialogue? What does it look like? How does it happen?
With regards to the Evangelical Student Dialogue specifically?
Good.
Yeah. I've been involved with that for probably 6 years now, maybe 7 years. we've had students coming basically every spring break for that amount of time, given a year or two off because of COVID. But we've had students coming onto campus, and for us as faculty, it's a great opportunity to invite our students into a space they don't normally experience on our campus because it's so predominantly Latter-day Saint. The student dialogue is it's really fantastic because as students come on, and we've had groups anywhere from 10 to 35 or so, I think, and so we have our students come in and they're greeted by really wonderful students who decided to spend their spring break in Utah and are visiting with our students, and it kind of opens up pretty naturally. Of course, we always provide pizza because anytime you want students to be involved and to stay,
food helps.
Food helps, yeah. So, and that's true of interfaith work generally.
Yeah,
so,
it is.
But we give them a few guidelines up front. We kind of help them see that each of our traditions it has a kind of invitation to interfaith work. Sometimes we have to look for it a little bit and realize it's there. But that invitation then sort of is given to the students to explore a number of questions that we pose to them and then sort of just see where that conversation goes. And I think, for everybody who's been involved, that conversation gets going and it's hard to get them to stop. We usually set it for an hour to 2 hours, depending on the groups. And at the end of 2 hours, they're still going. And they're not going to stop until you remind them that BYU students at least have to get to class, and even then they're like, well, I'll negotiate my way out. So, but it really
you
has
got to turn out the lights almost,
Yeah. But it really has been a great benefit for our students to have that opportunity. So, we, as far as
have you seen any development in the 6 years of your participation as one of the BYU faculty? Have you seen it change, develop, grow, or is it kind of pretty much a stable program?
Well, it is stable. In a certain sense, we've been able to kind of count on that happening, and our students look forward to it. But at the same time, there's a kind of depth that's developing over a long period of time, and I believe this is true of interfaith dialogues and activities generally. Is you do need some time to sort of let those. It's not so much that the same students continue with us because we have new students every time, and new students are brought in to for that. So it's not the same students who keep doing it. There are a few who've overlapped a couple of times maybe, but pretty rare. But it's sort of a culture that develops where our students are learning how to have that conversation, how to engage, and how to really think, about not as a kind of someone's coming in here who has a view that's different than mine, and I need to make sure I tell them what my view is so they understand it as the best view, right? But it becomes let's learn together. I'm always really intrigued when students come in and they start reading the Bible together. Yeah. And that just sort of naturally opens up all of those spaces where students can explore. Yeah. Before we started here, Mike was sharing a couple of thoughts from a student who sort of, the questions you never knew to ask, or the question you didn't know you didn't have an answer to, all of a sudden is there for you. Yeah. And I think that's the beauty of dialogue, is really you learn the things you know and the things you don't know. Yeah. And then you have somebody to learn from.
Right. And both of you can comment, but I'll start with Mike on this one. I have found in my work, which kind of goes back to about 1997 and engaging Robert Millett at the beginning, meeting Elder Jeffrey Holland of the Quorum of the 12, and then the years that have come and gone. We've been doing this student dialogue at BYU since May of 2003. So this literally was our 20th year, and we did a kind of a Zoom, what do we call that, not in person, but virtual meeting last year with the students, and that was okay, but it was not ideal. Yeah. Relationships are pretty fundamental to this interfaith interaction. People like to see each other and hear each other's voice and engage in laughter and chatter, but there's a real key to having the right people involved, to having the right people in positions of authority that give their blessing to this and say, yes, do it. And other people who say, not sure about this, I'm not comfortable with this, let's kind of tap it down a little bit. And we've experienced that with various deans at BYU, and your current dean, Scott Esplin. He's fantastic. I told Scott the other day when we were at BYU, We have never had a dean sit in, stop by, help with the pizzas, do all the things that you did to support this. And he literally said, I love it. I just love what's going on here. But what is that dynamic about regarding the right people in the right places at the right times for interfaith dialogue to really happen?
Yeah, I think I think that's an important question to ask. I think like every tradition has an exclusionary way of being if they want to embrace that kind of exclusive nature, and that's an allure to a lot of religions in which part of the community that forms with exclusive practices becomes a lot more tight-knit. It makes them special, it makes them important internally, and it creates a very strong community.
Yeah.
Those are exclusive practices, and those exclusive practices they also have a downside, and so it can include, race, gender, religion, and those are some of the downsides. And I think in every religion, as an individual embraces, the stance or the way that they understand their religion, this could deeply affect the way that an interfaith dialogue comes out. So if someone who is much more open-minded about individuals and not just trying to soothe differences, to come together and find out differences, evoke new questions, develop understanding, but the relationship between one religion and another is always a very, very much an intentional choice that emerges. And individuals in every church are making exclusive practices their primary goals, and they actually find comfort and they even find God in that. Whereas there's others who have chosen to embrace a kind of religious devotion that includes more, understands differences but loves that difference, and so it is an attitude. But it's also about, you have to have the experience. You have to begin to engage within it. And so I think in an interfaith dialogue, oftentimes you will see the exclusionary measures that someone might take. But then you see the others, and it isn't that one or the other is more devoted to their religion. That's what's interesting about this. Yeah. And so, especially in world religions class, I always make our primary theme, how do we follow the second great commandment? And evoking that kind of importance, the second great commandment from Christ, it enables us maybe to push towards embracing an openness rather than a closedness. Yeah. And so I think I don't know how someone becomes interested in that, but to me it seems like a core principle of being very Christian is to open ourselves up to something that's different. We're not trying to make it the same as us. We're trying to understand it and form relationships around it. That can create an entirely new kind of community for you, one that's more inclusive, more loving, more open. And I think that's a major part of it. I think it's a lot more complex than just that, but that's probably a beginning to start asking the question, is who's going to be a good interfaith companion with you?
Yeah, facilitator. Good. Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. Good feedback.
Yeah, I think that when you feel comfortable with someone and you trust someone, you're going to be able to be influenced by them and also feel that you can influence them at the same time. And I think that love component is the number one in this, is that we're not coming as arrogant people, coming with, I have it all together and I know what's what. And so if I come to the table like that, I'm not going to learn anything. If I come to the table with wanting to love, then I'm going to probably come away with some things that I've learned.
And that's an interesting, point, because I think there's a sort of attitude that's required to really do interfaith work and interfaith dialogue well. And it does sort of require that we place even our most deeply held convictions on the table and just let them be there. And it can be challenging and somewhat, frightening to have other people examine those while you're sitting there telling them about them, right? There's a kind of openness that we have to a kind of posture that we have to take that is open and is willing to put those things out there. And there's a kind of trust that is required. And it comes from that sense of we're in this not to do the battling, right? But we're in this to kind of learn from each other and see if maybe somebody who sees things a little bit differently or very differently even might actually help me understand my own life of faith and my own walk differently, and more richly and deeply. I think that's a really valuable part of it.
Well, there's an old adage that comes from India, an Indian proverb that says, if you want to know about water, don't ask the fish, because the fish has no counter perspective. It only knows water. It doesn't know the opposite of water. It doesn't know air. And I think a lot of times when it comes to interfaith religious conversation, you do have a spectrum of response from some that are very exclusive in their perception of their faith, and they're right and they're correct and they're truthful, and they have a very a kind of they're challenged by this idea of being friendly and engaging because I don't want them to think that I don't think I'm right and they're wrong, so there's kind of a guardian feeling there. Versus the other side, which says I really don't care if I'm right or they're right or I'm wrong or they're wrong. I just want to have a feel-good experience here. Yeah. And I think what we've tried to carve out is a good, solid middle ground there, where we want, and I'm hoping that a lot of our Biola University students, Westmont College students, APU, Azusa Pacific, Alabama, and certainly a whole lot of BYU students and institute. I hope the word gets out about this podcast and they respond and kind of listen in and give comment and feedback as you guys were have been so involved currently and in the past these last 20 years. But we've really sensed that when these students sit down at a table and look across a table at people that look a lot like them, they're college students like us, they're about our age, men and women. There is a bit of diversity in the students themselves, and they just start talking like they would to anybody in any other context, and then the conversation just becomes richer and richer, and it goes from, well, tell me where you're from, to so how long have you been a member of the LDS Church? How long have you been an evangelical? Why are you an evangelical? Why are you a Latter-day Saint? What doctrines are most appealing to you? And they just go and go, and you really cannot put a lid on it, as Andy was saying moments ago, because I think what we find out, and particularly with Gen Z and millennials and all that, we're told that they don't have an attention span, because everything is quick and fast. But that's not true when it comes to interfaith dialogue. They can go the distance, and they seem to really thoroughly enjoy it. And I was just going to use one example from a Westmont College student, a Hispanic young man, who was kind of shy in personality and timid in his own thing. And I said, so Carl, how much did you enjoy doing the interfaith dialogue? He said, I was really scared when I signed up for this because I thought I was going to have to be put on the spot, answer all these deep theological questions, know everything inside and out, and be able to defend what I believe against people who believe differently. But he said, it's just like having a conversation. It was so easy, and I thoroughly loved it. And so I thought that was a really cool evaluation comment from one student who came in fairly intimidated and walked away going, I'm coming back next year, because this was so much fun. I don't know if you guys get that kind of feedback. What are you hearing from your students?
Yeah, I think similar things. I was fearful, and then it turned out really quite nice. I think that's the most common response that I got. They have to write something up after they go for my class. But I think when you start thinking about the idea of right belief, so individual churches, there's a kind of embrace of right belief. It's a central issue to most Christian religions. Are going to begin to think about, do I have the right answer? Is this something that is true, that is right? And I think the complexity of a person's faith and the reality of their life and their connection, relationship with God, relationship with their community, it's so much more complex than this kind of intellectual ascendancy. An individual who says, well, I know something that is far more important, that is far better, that is right, in which something else is wrong. These are the kind of dialogues that you might see a theologian engage with another theologian. It isn't that practical for average individuals who are looking for a faithful lifestyle. And so you see students, these average students who are engaged in some of their primary reasons for believing is because they go and they join a community in which they can feel God's presence, or they serve their neighbor, they mow their neighbor's lawn, and it makes a big difference in their lives. And so I think once individuals start dealing with their own humanity, and the humanity comes up front in which they can value individuals because of who they are and what their experiences have been, that was the experience of most of my students. Not a battle of the wits, an individual who had the right answers versus an individual who couldn't quite foster the knowledge or understanding of God to express what they believed. That seems like a fiction to me.
Yeah.
I think we can construct that environment in which we have a debate about a true theological principle or what the Bible says about one thing or the other. But for students, this is a matter of like truly what's in their hearts. What do they do in their average day? How eager are they to find God? And so when you get an evangelical and a Mormon who sit down, it's as if those have so much, they've developed so far in their lives, they've felt God in their lives. Like one student, I don't know if you remember this, but one student said, I loved this because she told me, this was Latter-day Saint told the evangelical, that she could see God in him. And that's what she loved about the experience.
I remember that comment. That was kind of a public comment, right?
Yeah. Which is a very powerful comment in which what happened there was people have experienced God in their lives, and it wasn't entangled with a kind of language or kind of expression that had to be done in those specific terms.
Yeah.
It was sincere, and they felt it between each other, and it was a positive,
beautiful
human religious experience.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I think all of us have had this kind of experience where we're having a conversation and somebody says something and you go, oh my goodness, I've never thought about it that way. And it really changes your thinking. It changes maybe how you see God. And I wonder if either of you have heard from any students if there's any particular subject or conversation that was had that they went, oh wow, that I see that quite differently, or even a conversation maybe that you've had.
Yeah, one of this comes up quite a bit with my students, because when we start advertising that there's an opportunity for students to participate in dialogue, and we tell them there's evangelical students coming. For many of our students who've served Latter-day Saint missions, the evangelical conversation has never really been a positive one for them. And so there's a kind of hesitancy there.
Yeah.
And it is that sort of, I've done this before. I know what this is going to be like, and they're sort of kind of running into each other and throwing
Debating,
Bible verses at each other, and they come into this setting where we're doing something very different than that. We aren't, it's not that we aren't talking about our theological views, that we aren't, we are doing all of that, and our students do that in these conversations. They put everything on the table, but what's changed is the purpose of it, right? Where dialogues of understanding are meant to sort of just increase our ability to understand, as Mike said, the humanity of someone, and to understand how they have experienced God in their lives. And our students come away from these conversations, and very often they'll say something, along the lines of, I never realized what a difference it is when we take the desire to convert somebody off the table and just sit down and talk.
Yeah.
And I think that, to me, is something that's really valuable about these conversations. Is many of our students have been out there as Latter-day Saint missionaries, and have worn the name badge and have been out there proselytizing, and that's a very valuable experience for them, and it's life-changing for many of them. And one of the great things is that as they come into these conversations with students on campus, now all of a sudden it's enriching in a kind of way that isn't the same thing as what they've been doing as a missionary. And it's really awesome to see that.
That's very scriptural too, because Paul tells us, that we're going to plant the seed and the Holy Spirit's going to water and God's going to do the converting. And it really takes it off the table for us, and it allows us to be in loving relationships with each other without worrying about that.
Yeah. It's not just the LDS side that has this proselyting, kind of DNA,
Right.
to its structure and to its culture. But evangelicals are all about witnessing and sharing the faith and sharing the good news. So we have two real faithful communities, I think. And I think part of this understanding the nature of the evangelical culture and community and the Latter-day Saint community, I think it probably speaks to why we have had tensions in the past, because we're trying to win you to our perspective of truth, and vice versa. You're trying to win us, and we have bad blood and bad attitudes, and we've had some cantankerous conversations. And so over the last 2 decades, here we've kind of said to the evangelical students coming from Biola and Westmont APU and Wheaton College and other places in Mobile, Alabama, hey, we're going to invite you to come, but not argue. We're going to invite you to sit by invitation at Brigham Young University, where they feed you a lunch as their honored guest. We're going to invite you to go to an Institute of Religion in Logan or Ogden or Salt Lake or Orem or St. George or Cedar City. And believe me, every one of those settings is different, because the culture of Cedar City is very different than the culture of Salt Lake, community. And you're getting a different kind of LD. I mean, in our Salt Lake dialogue at the Salt Lake Institute, there was a Latter-day Saint woman who kind of made a very strong statement about her concerns about the LDS Church's views of women, and I was like, oh my, she's here to make a point, and she wants the professor to know that she's concerned about some of these things, and so, but I think when we take that piece out and say it's not to have an argument, it's not to contend, you're not evangelizing, you're not proselyting, you literally are coming to make a friend, to understand what does it mean to think like a Latter-day Saint, to experience LDS thinking. And so when we sit together, and when Dick Bennett used to have us at his home and bring BYU students down for an evening event, it was even more intimate, because it felt like a family home evening experience. That's what we called it, family home evening with the Bennetts. And these students would sit together and laugh, and literally, some people might be bothered by this, but they would pray with one another and say, and they do now. You'll see a group of students or so that, hey, before we leave, can we pray for one another? And they pray for one another. And I'm not nervous about that or fearful of that, because I see the joy, and there's nothing like having to hold your faith. I'll use an example among the evangelicals. They go to a Bible class at their Christian college, and they learn about the Trinity, and they just go, oh, that's what we believe. We believe in the Trinity. It's 3 in 1, 1 in 3. It makes sense to me, and I don't even question it. I don't even doubt it. And then they sit down with a Latter-day Saint in Logan, Utah, who says, so do you guys really believe this thing about 3 in 1 and Trinity? And boy, that's just so hard to explain. And they start to try to explain it and realize it is a very complicated doctrine, and I'm not sure I can explain it. And do I even know if I believe this? And rather than it being just some tumultuous, shattering of their faith experience, it really is kind of an awakening moment. Like, I need to know why I believe what I say I believe, and not just take it for granted. And the same thing can go with the plan of happiness or the law of eternal progression or aspects of Mormon theology that the LDS student just takes for granted because everybody believes this, right? And we're the one true church or whatever, and all of a sudden you have to go, wow, I don't know how I can explain this in a way that will make sense to someone else. So I think it's a very positive experience in that regard. So, I just think we should share more stories about these experiences.
Yeah. I think there's a good point to be had with that. So you imagine like sitting down with someone who is intellectually capable of understanding, but also finding flaws within the things that you're talking about. It automatically brings a kind of carefulness, both in the dialogue, but in what you're saying, and a serious sense of humility about the things that you do know. And so when it comes to belief and faith, the kind of faith and belief that you're garnering because of your need to articulate something to someone who is quite aware and can have a counter argument, it brings a balance, and it brings this humility. Like if there was a kind of humility about the things that we believed, knowing that access to God is a complicated business, and that access to God, whether we know 5% of everything that should be known, or 2%, or maybe 95%, regardless, there are these blank spots that enable us to like step back and value other humans' expressions and hope and reach for God creates an environment in which we could truly learn and become better and foster faith in ways that we never could have without them. And the dialogue brings that kind of carefulness to it. I understand that what I'm about to say seems extremely mystical or contradictive. And in some ways, the metaphors and the way we speak, the contradiction and the metaphor is the point. Yeah. It is the way that we're accessing God. And instead, we're leaving it back up to this logical, propositional reality that in some ways isn't intended to be defended. If I was to always have this absoluteness hung around my neck, it would be a burden far too hard for me to carry. But most of my life is like drawn out of the faith, the hope that I have that God is right there, engaged in my own life. And so the Interfaith for me has offered that reality to students more than I can ever imagine.
Yeah.
Yesterday, you brought up a difference between us, and one is that we often do things with systematic theology, and LDS don't. Will you explain to our audience what systematic theology is and how that plays out in the differences of how we may be communicating to each other?
Yeah, I'm certainly the wrong person to describe systematic theology for sure. My expression, as I understand systematic theology, is a very careful systematic search of the Bible, and exegetically, very definitively finding the truths that are in that Bible. I understand it's far more complex than that, but as a simple definition,
is there a sense too that, like, because this, then this kind of thing, that they all kind of work together? Yeah. You wouldn't be able to say this if you didn't believe this, right, kind of thing.
Yeah, so using like the law of non-contradiction, right? And the point I have about that is Latter-day Saints don't have that. And so in some ways, it's a contrast between a very systematic theology that develops ideas that are well worked through, logical, systematic, and come from the book, right? Come from holy text. And so there's a lot of value in that. There's something that emerges out of that has a kind of stability in a watery ocean of the world. Yeah. And so there's this anchor that ties us to the good word of the book, right? Yeah. In the LDS faith, there certainly is this kind of authority that emerges out of Scripture, but there's also a tradition, a prophetic tradition, that also establishes a kind of anchor for individuals within, as Latter-day Saints, to assure themselves that is the answer. And so there's these authoritative sources, and often those sources, they seem as if there is no malleability to them. In fact, it's even advantageous for communities to see them as absolutely immovable. It creates a kind of stability and strength in the community that just can't really be denied. And so when you run up against an interfaith group, especially one that is, I would say, sola scriptura versus sola profeta, if I can say that. I've been trying to say that's my word, but I don't know if I can claim it.
You wrote a whole book on it.
But there's two very different authoritative sources that are worth thinking about and understanding, especially when those come in contradiction to each other inside of an interfaith dialogue. So I think that was the kind of the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, I know in some circles that I run in, we say, okay, what we have in common is the Bible. So let's talk about the Bible and really dig into that. But I know in the student dialogue, sometimes you do because you want to learn about a person's faith, and so you're going outside of those lines as well. Do you think that there's one way that's better than the other, or do you understand how both can be helpful, to just stick with the Bible or to look at the whole picture?
You want to take that?
Sure. I'll give a context from a different dialogue that I participate in. It's a Jewish Latter-day Saint academic dialogue. And in the Jewish tradition, there's a practice of reading sacred text together with a dialogue partner. and it really does become a conversation about what the text is saying and trying to understand if we read it the same.
Just to clarify, are you just looking at Old Testament, or what
We've done it
passages are you
with,
looking at?
so traditionally within Judaism, of course, that would be done with the biblical text. But as a Jewish Latter-day Saint dialogue, we have read from the Bible, we've read from the New Testament together, we've read from the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants. So we've read a little bit of everything.
Okay.
We've also read rabbinic writings and things like that as a way to kind of explore the traditions. But one of the things that happens, even if we say, okay, we're going to stick with the Bible, we learn that we read the Bible differently, and we interpret it differently.
Yeah.
And so we may be sitting there, and we could be reading from, Matthew or something, and we are just bringing a whole set of ideas, practices, doctrines, teachings that sort of influence how we read that text. And the other person is doing the same thing. And so that idea of sola scriptura for Latter-day Saints is a really hard concept because we can't divorce it from the prophetic tradition, from these extra biblical texts that we use. And so it's really complicated to have that happen. And I think in this evangelical dialogue, I really get excited when students say, well, let's open up the Bible and let's read it. And I think both sides come away from that going, I had never thought of that way of reading the text, but it seems like it makes sense, or at least I can see how it could make sense to somebody else.
Right.
And that to me is
That's
really
a win
exciting.
right there.
Yeah,
That's
it's
a win.
really exciting because one of the things it does is it forces us to acknowledge the fact that we may hold that there's a proper way to read the text, but the possibility that someone else reads it differently is also an invitation to explore it more deeply.
Yeah.
And I love that part of it.
And I know we're kind of just having a conversation. That's what this is intended to be anyways, more of a sitting around a table, just chit-chatting with one another, and so we don't have an absolute structure in our conversation. But I'm just going to suppose that there's somebody watching this who's come upon this podcast and see this evangelical couple and these two professors from BYU talking so wonderfully about dialogue, and they're thinking, but wait a minute. We are right and they are wrong. Do you ever get to that point? I can remember in the early days when we were advocating for a new paradigm of interaction, literally I was accused of being on the payroll of the Mormon Church, being somehow duped by the LDS Church, being a kind of an undercover assistant to and I'd say, why do you think that? And they, because you're too friendly, you're too connected. If they knew what you really thought, they wouldn't trust you like that. And so you have to, and you think, wow, we have so much agenda, so much fear of this. And, what happens if an evangelical student goes, I'm really impressed with the story of the Book of Mormon, and I think I'm going to believe it. Does that mean shut down the dialogue, all hands on deck, protect our own? or is this some kind of liberal thing, where people just kind of water down truth and, the Mormons are fine, the Catholics are fine, the Buddhists are fine, the Muslims are fine, the Jews are fine, so there's that kind of two spectrums. The liberalization, is that dangerous, or the lack of boldness, the lack of confrontation, is that a weakness of dialogue? What do you guys think about that? Those two critiques of dialogue.
Well, I'll start, and then Mike can add some coherency to it. I think there is dialogue. As I said earlier, I think there is a kind of attitude that it requires.
Yeah.
And every time we come together to formalize in some way dialogue, it requires that everybody be at the table with an understanding of what the sort of ground rules are.
Yeah.
Whenever I participate in a dialogue, I want to be at the table with my beliefs, with my sincerely held theological ideas, so that the person who's there with me understands where I'm coming from. And I think we can only be our genuine selves in those moments. And I've had a lot of experiences where I fundamentally disagree with somebody I'm in dialogue with. But I'm always invited to see it. So Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in a great essay that he wrote, No Religion is an Island, invites all of us. He says, and I'll paraphrase it here, but when we first come together, we have to see each other as human beings.
Yeah, that's our starting
If I
point.
can start there, right? Not as an enemy, not as somebody I disagree with or agree with, but as just a human being who deserves the same kind of respect that I can give them and they towards me. If we start there, and then all of a sudden our differences begin to emerge, if we can remember that first starting point, then I think our dialogue isn't going to bring us to a point where everybody's okay. Because, Diana Eck, who is kind of really big into pluralism and the Harvard Pluralism Project, talks about everybody being at the table with their own convictions. Mm-hmm. It's not that I leave my convictions behind, but I come to the table with those. And then it's that working out of the differences and how we're going to, as a society, as a community, continue forward together, even though we hold those views that are we don't see each other and each other's theological views in the same light, but we can still move forward. I think that's one of the great aspects of the dialogue project that our students are getting is I don't have to see evangelicals as somebody I have to fear, or somebody that whenever somebody says, "Oh, well, I'm evangelical," all of a sudden sort of the radars go up and I'm ready to engage in a biblical discussion.
Either with defensiveness on the one hand,
right.
or
a watered down version of my own beliefs. Yeah,
because Dr. Martin Marty from the University of Chicago, historian, he was the one that first coined the phrase. I know Dr. Mao picked it up, and Bob Millett and I have used it a ton in our public dialogues. The idea of a convicted civility, an idea that I can be civil and convicted. A lot of people are very convicted about what they believe and not very civil. A lot of people are very civil but not very convicted. And we thought, again, there's got to be this middle ground where robust, healthy, vigorous, thoughtful, intellectual dialogue is permitted while we're at the same very time fulfilling that second great commandment to love one another, to be respectful, to be caring, to be sensitive. And we know, even in racial tensions in our country, as little children, people from an African-American family, a little child, or a Caucasian family, or a Hispanic family, or an Asian family, they just come to the same little nursery class and they just play together, and they don't have these predetermined views of each other. But somehow through their growth and development and their own culturalization in society, they begin to realize, oh, that's different, and maybe that's not good. And we have to get to a place where we don't look at difference as bad, but as an expression of beauty, and then appreciate it. And again, we don't have, I can sit down with a Muslim person and talk about their view. We have a neighbor, a very traditional Islamic family, and we visit with one another about the Quran. He's invited me into his home, which I know is a very significant gesture on his part. He's come to our backyard for a barbecue, and that was a very, very kind gesture on his part to receive our invitation. And we respect one another. Now, fundamentally, he knows that I believe Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father, and that my Christian faith is my conviction. But we're good neighbors to each other, and he always says, the Quran says, there's a great value in a good neighbor, and you are a good neighbor. And I said, okay, great. I'm glad. That's common ground. But I think that this fear and our lack of ability to kind of just realize that difference is not bad. Different is not bad. Different is reality, and it can be a beautiful, amazing thing, and you can still hold on to what you believe and hold on to, or just maybe something will expand, or you gain a new insight or a new perspective, or at least say, I never thought of that before.
That's one of the great things about this student dialogue, I think, is that it bleeds into every area of our lives. I mean, we could talk about this with politics as well. Sometimes we think because of what the news shows, we got people way over here and way over here. But as we kind of learn about individuals and we learn about how we feel about things, I may feel the same way as these people do over here in this area, but in this area I feel the same way as these people over here. And I believe that the media really tries to show us all as very polarized and very different. Yeah. And these dialogues provide a way for us to really learn how we can take this into every area of our life and really be loving towards other people and humble.
Yeah, I was going to say, following up on that and what Andy said too, he says, there's a point in interfaith dialogue where I've totally disagreed with someone. That's how I feel a lot of the time in my own community. And then I went to the interfaith dialogue, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's a reflection of everybody's community. Sometimes there's an imagined community, a community in which you perceive all of the things that you think are are being accepted and fully embraced within your community.
Right.
And the reality is the difference that we seek after may actually be within our own communities. And so the practice of interfaith is an expression outside of those, maybe someone who's even more different than inside of your community. So it isn't like an imagined community is fine. It brings a kind of continuity that emerges in everybody's community. But then looking at someone who is totally different and finding the disagreements and finding the difference, and then the purpose of finding the difference is to enable you to love them because of those differences.
Yeah.
So imagine how transformative that would be across religions, but more importantly, what would this actually do to our own communities? What happens if I'm sitting in my own community hoping that the person who I totally disagree with on the other side of Sunday school is in fact turns into an even more positive experience? That's why I like what you were saying is this isn't just something that we do so that we can call ourselves good people. It's the kind of stuff that good people do.
Hey, that's good.
And
that's very good.
that seems like, isn't that the core of where we're at?
Yeah. Well, and again, if we go to the historical snapshot, Jared Halverson, who's a professor up at the Institute of Utah, the University of Utah, but coming to the blue land of BYU next year. You've just stolen one of our great institute faculty members and brought him down your way. So he'll be a great addition. But Jared loves to use the Google Maps illustration, and he says, when you zoom in, you can see streets and neighborhoods, and you pull out a little bit, you see cities. And you pull out a little bit further when you're zooming, and now you just see county lines, and then you just see state lines, and then you just see country lines. And then when you zoom back far enough, all you have is an earth with no lines. And he said, what the challenge is for us is as we zoom in and get more and more specified and specific about our understanding of culture and language and politics and thoughts and our belief systems and all that, then we become more aware of the diversity. But he said, when we pull back, we realize that common starting point of humanity, that, as evangelicals, we speak of God, creating us in his image, and that we have the very image of God, whether you're born in Saudi Arabia or North America or Latin America or Asia, you come with the very image of God, man and woman, created in God's image, with the aptitude and understanding of what God wants for us. Of course, we have cultural filters, and we have all these filters that help us to think different things and go down different paths. But at the end of the day, we do believe, and I think you do too, that this practice of a theological conversation, a dialogue, an assessment of convicted civility allows us not only to learn and to respect and to maybe not be so divided and to be so filled with animosity over differences and just respect those differences. It's interesting, like in the past, evangelicals have been really quite uncomfortable working even on certain political family values issues in America. We've kind of said, no, we don't want to work with you. But in more recent years, as our culture has become more secular, all of a sudden Catholics and evangelicals and Latter-day Saints are saying, hey, we might need to work together if we want to stand up for these values and to stand up for these particular candidates or whatever. And all of a sudden, the circumstances have been changing, and it's forced us to think anew. And I just think it over and over again, those that are fearful of the dialogue, those are fearful that it's a liberalization of our church, or fearful that it's not bold enough and not courageous enough. And Paul writes in to contend earnestly in the book of Jude for the faith once delivered. So what does contention look like? You got to be contentious. And I think, gosh, read all of Paul, though. Don't just take that one phrase. You understand that Paul is all things to all people that I might win some. And there on Mars Hill, he's talking among the Greek intellectuals in Athens, and most of them said he's a nut and a fool. Some said, come back and talk with us another day. But it does say a few followed. So he had influence on a few, and it's just kind of the way it is, You have to be patient. You have to be humble. You have to be gracious. And, as you guys know, these evangelical visiting students get the privilege of meeting with the general authority, and they all did recently. And I was actually able to talk to this general authority who'd never met with our students before, first-time experience for him. And I was able to say to him, I said, it's really great for these students to get a chance to meet was an authority of your stature and to get your feedback and all that. But I said, I want to say something further. I think it's kind of valuable for you too, because you're hearing, 10, 15, 20 students ask you hard questions that you're never asked by people that you're around, because they all believe the same thing you do. And that expands your intellectual challenges, and you have to think through these things. And he said, Greg, you make a great point. It's not just good for them, it's good for me too. So, and I thought that was pretty cool for him to concede that and admit that. And I think that's, again, the value of this dialogue. So, I don't know. Where else do we need to go? Whatever else we haven't covered.
I think we've covered a lot of areas. I think for me, there's a real trust in God to take my words and my conversation and to make that what he wants to make it. And I have a real belief that the truth is going to win out, And so even as I'm convicted that this is what is true, I have a certain sense of, like, all the knowledge in the world, I may have a little pinprick of it, but God has all of it, and he has all of it in his hands, and I know of his great love for each one of us and his desire for each one of us to know him. And so there's a certain level of, God, I'm going to do this. I'm going to talk with the people that you've put in front of me, and I'm going to trust you for the influence and the change in both my life and in the people that I get a chance to talk to. And
kind of just leave the results to him and let the Holy Spirit be the Holy Spirit. I don't change anybody's heart. I don't have the knowledge, the wit, the intellect, the persuasion abilities.
You're pretty good.
No, I really am not. But the Holy Spirit is good, and he can, that's what Bob Millet and I said years ago. We sat in the car outside of my church building where I was serving, and I just said, Bob, if I had to admit it, I'd love to see you become an evangelical. I really would. I'd just love for you to have my belief systems and fellowship with me in a local church, and we could be just brothers in Christ. And vice versa, I'm pretty sure that if I came to you and said, would you rebaptize me into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that you'd be thrilled to do so, and you'd love that idea of us being in companionship and spiritual understanding. And I said, but, at this point, that's not happening, so why don't we defer our agenda to a greater agenda, to God's agenda? Whatever God wants to do in Bob Millet's life, may God do it. Whatever God wants to do in Greg Johnson's life, may God do it. And we can just be the participant. I can even remember when I was a high school student at Whittier Christian High School, I was on a sports team, and we were driving to a sports event, and the bus driver happened to be a Latter-day Saint. And so, all the kids were like, hey, he's a Latter-day Saint, talk to him, Greg, because I was known as that guy, the former Latter-day Saint. So I started talking with him, and this guy he was a bus driver, but he knew his stuff, and we were going back and forth, and I was in the front row, and everybody was listening, and I remember feeling like, if this is just if this is just a game of who's smarter than the other person, that can't be the way. And I remember saying at the very end, I said, I know you think you're right, and I think I'm right. But I know, too, that I want to concede anything that I don't believe correctly. If God wants to inform me that I have a false belief or a bad idea, I want to give that up. And I'm going to trust that you would, too, if God spoke to you about it. And I said, my only hope is that someday, at least the concept to me was real, that it would be better for us to do everything we could this side of heaven, to love each other, respect one another, and talk with one another, and be friends, so that, as we cross the line of death and go into the future and to the eternity, that we had done everything we could to hear from God, to learn from God, and let God be judge, at the end of the day. But I said, it would be really foolish for us just to be stubborn and say, you're wrong, and you're going to hell, and you're going to the second kingdom, or, as though we knew anyways, right? And I remember thinking, gosh, I will not have any joy in if I'm right and the Latter-day Saint is wrong, and that has a very serious eternal consequence. Am I going to go, well, I told you so? No, I think I will grieve, because then you're my friend. I've experienced life with you, and so and vice versa. And our soteriology is a little bit different. We have postmortem understandings that's different. So, it's actually easier for us because we get a second chance. you guys might not get a second chance, and we're right, so we're a little bit more nervous. But anyways, all that being set aside, I just think that it just speaks to me what we've seen with scholars engaging with scholars, students engaging with students, and even some of the primary leaders of the LDS Church with primary evangelical leadership engaging and having a new conversation. I wish people would realize that's really a beautiful thing and a good thing, and not something to be afraid of and fearful of and critical of and negative towards, because I think there is so much good coming from these last 20 years. And I think of some guy who lives in Rochester, New York, or Dallas, Texas, who was an LDS student at BYU 15 years ago, or vice versa, an evangelical student, and now they have a neighbor who's an evangelical or Latter-day Saint, and they don't fear each other. They love each other. Hey, when I was in college, I met with a bunch of evangelicals. When I was in college, I got to know a lot of LDS students, and I just love LDS people, you know?
It really saddens us when we hear that missionaries go to evangelical homes and don't get a warm welcome. And so that's something I hope you out there will hear too, and maybe change the way you engage Mormon missionaries when they come to your home, that it could be more like a dialogue and something where they really feel that you are hospitable and loving towards them, rather than trying to convince them that they're wrong, and have some really good, healthy conversation.
Yeah.
Well, I think I want to go back to something that Jill said earlier, which is, we sometimes see, society kind of tells us, oh, this person's over here in this camp and this person's in this camp, or I'm in this campus, they must be over here then. Sometimes we forget that even when we look at a particular camp or a religious tradition and we say, oh, that's what they believe, we don't actually know what they believe until they start talking. Right. And having, 4 or 5 evangelical students and 4 or 5 Latter-day Saint students sitting down talking with each other, all of a sudden the Latter-day Saints go, I don't think I agree with that Latter-day Saint.
Yeah, right.
And there's something really beautiful about that, because it requires us to say, okay, so here's somebody who has a very similar kind of religious background as I do, but their experience is different. And, I can't actually know what that experience is until I visit with them, until I hear it out from them. And I think that's so valuable for us, Yes, of course, when Latter-day Saint missionaries go into evangelical homes, I hope they have a wonderful reception there, that they're received well, and it's a great conversation. I also know that for my own tradition, we can do better as missionaries. My son's leaving on a mission later this summer, and I'm really excited for him. But I'm also kind of worried that I haven't taught him all the skills he's going to need to be able to do that in a way that is sincere and honest, but also deeply genuine and just kind of has a kind of generosity to it that I hope he takes with him. So.
Well, I know Mike's going to comment, but I just want to say this. I'm going to speak to our camera here, and if you're just listening by podcast on iTunes or Apple, what is it called, Marco? Apple iTunes? Spotify. Thank you. I just went off camera a little bit to get some help. But if you're listening, particularly with what Jill just said, if you live in the South, the Bible Belt, Atlanta, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas. You are the ones with the reputation, by the way, of being a little hard on the LDS missionaries. And I've heard too many stories right here in Utah from former missionaries of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints being treated not so nice in the South, South Carolina, North Carolina, all you guys. So I think I'm going to challenge the Bible Belt to live up to the Bible teaching here. And if you want to get mad at me, go ahead. But I'm just saying that I think that the South needs to rise up and do a little bit better in treating people of the LDS faith with greater kindness and patience, because again, I just hear too many stories from when I was a missionary and wherever. Boy, they were brutal. They were tough on us. They threw things at us. They yelled at us. They cursed at us even. So come on, Bible Belt, let's be better with our LDS friends.
Yeah, I think that goes 2 ways.
Yeah, it does.
You think about like when you're in those really formidable years, 18 to 24, or whatever the age is. It's kind of an important space. I remember running into evangelical students that were preparing for ministry on my mission.
Okay.
And there was a lot of contention there.
Yeah.
But what was kind of beautiful about it is like these young people really caring about God and devoting their lives to God. And so in some ways you see kind of it's a remarkable thing that our youth are doing these kinds of things on both sides.
Yeah.
And I think as grown adults, we have the responsibility not only to value what they're doing, but also to look at them and realize that they too can learn from us, whether it's in the South or I went to Hawaii because I was pretty lucky.
Yes, you were.
You were suffering.
Those are kind of experiences. I remember particularly a pastor that I taught the discussions to, and he had already had them 10 or 12 times or whatever, and he was far superior my knowledge, intellect, experience, and I remember deeply hoping that he would get baptized. And in the end, I reflect on it, and I remember how much I learned from him.
Interesting.
I remember how kind he was.
Wow.
But he also didn't let me fudge about what I believed or what it looks like when I'm describing this to someone. Yeah. And it was a brilliant experience. It was the kind of experience that I think Interfaith provokes.
Yeah.
And so on my mission, I do remember the pastor who loved me, and he never
cool.
agreed with me, ever.
Yeah.
And I learned so much. So once again, we're talking about a human trait that God is asking us to master. Yeah. A kind of trait that is loving your neighbor, which this is like the hardest one. Like in my deepest, darkest times, to love God is the easiest and most likely thing that I do. But in my deepest, darkest times, to love my neighbor is when I perform the worst. It's like that moment that is the difficulty lays out in front of you, and to sort through it is a near impossible task. So I wonder why we can't do that together, like the pastor did for me on my mission. Yeah. And changed my life.
You said something yesterday while we had you over for lunch. You said, and it's interesting. Maybe this is a reflective opportunity for each of us to examine the way we approach this kind of opportunity, because you said there are some people that are very conservative that have a broad-mindedness to them, an open-mindedness to them, that they can still do this even though they're very convicted. And there are other people who are maybe even perhaps a little bit more liberal or not as conservative, let's say it that way, who seem to struggle with this because they're very defined by the boundary and the exclusion thing. And sometimes can be surprising that somebody very conservative can be very good at dialogue versus somebody who's a little bit more broader in their thinking can be very challenged to do this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So it's not a one-size-fits-all or not super predictable. It really requires a heart and an attitude that it really truly does put people first, love others as you would like to be loved, the golden rule.
And that conviction to your faith, I think you're there because you've become convicted. And that matters. So when everything becomes relative, I don't think there's a dialogue to be had. There's a kind of just acceptance and easily just allowing boundaries to be dissipate automatically. When it comes to this kind of dialogue, there's an important part of it where you are convicted. That's why the other person is interested. I need to know why you found God, how you found God, what the power of your community looks like. Right. And that's why I say, like, maybe that conservative type that is eagerly and actively, almost zealously convicted, but has an attitude of openness that can emerge, and their conservativeness is the strength. Whereas I don't know when relativity helps. I don't know that that's the strongest trait, even though we're going to, in some places, that will be inevitable. Yeah. But I think that's a good point to be had, is that there, and back to Andy's point, there is a kind of attitude that one can garner along the way. Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that, and I tell my students this all the time, that with interfaith work, you can learn to do it.
Yeah, that's great.
We don't have to be afraid of it, right? Yeah. It is difficult. It's extremely difficult work. Even after you've been doing it for years and years, it can be very challenging, but you can learn to do it. And you can even try, just as a person who lives next door to somebody, to say, come on over, let's have dinner. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And then you have to have those conversations sometimes. Well, what are you allowed to eat? Yeah. What can I cook for you that you'll be able to be very comfortable eating with me? Yes. And that's an interfaith conversation. Yes, it is. Right? And that's something that we don't have to be afraid of those. We can learn to do it. We just have to be willing to have a little bit of courage to step out there and find that common space between us.
Well, patron saint of dialogue, Christian Stendhal, something we all know, that concept of always leaving room for a little holy envy with your religious other.
Yeah.
Maybe the way they worship, maybe the way they express their music, maybe the way they read their scripture, maybe the way they live out their faith is something that even if you don't agree with it, you can say, and I think, frankly, evangelicals across the country would say very kind things about Latter-day Saints, particularly your commitment to community, particularly to your commitment to caring for one another and serving and just showing up and doing so much. I mean, you're an example to many other faith communities of how to put your faith in action. And I have holy envy. I can tell you there's a lot of pastors in Utah who have holy envy for the LDS church's, priesthood quorums and Relief Society efforts that they just show up and do and like, well, how come we can't see that kind of response in our church, So, we can learn from that. You can learn and we can learn, and it can be a mutually beneficial experience. Hey, I was wondering if we could close, Jill, by each of us telling, not a long story, and that's probably my problem more than anybody's, but maybe just a quick story of a personal dialogue moment that you either witnessed or been a part of, that you've heard from a student or interacted or heard of afterwards, that really was meaningful. And just kind of leave on a note of sharing with everybody, why we think this dialogue thing is so wonderful and valuable and good and at its very core beneficial.
Can one of you start? I'm going to have to take a minute to think
I'll go
about
ahead and start.
that.
One of the things that I've noticed recently, even from 5 or 6 years ago, is that our students, as they're kind of wrapping up the dialogues, they've started to embrace each other. They've started to, take pictures with each other as a way to kind of remember this moment.
Yeah.
And we go to a lot of meetings, we go to a lot of different kinds of events. It's not so often that we embrace each other, and it's not so often that we, want to remember something.
Yeah.
And these kinds of student dialogues, I've had a student just this last semester, after one of these dialogues came up and said, I felt more alive religiously in that conversation than I have felt in a very long time.
Wow.
And to me, that is exactly what we're hoping for, right? It wasn't that the student isn't moved by her faith. It's just she felt alive in it. And it was that sort of common effort by both groups of students to find that. Yeah. And I think that, to me, was something that just really moved me.
Yeah, very cool. Great story. Mike? If you have one.
Yeah, I think so. In this last year, there's a member of our outreach council who is he actively studies Islam. And I remember he came to our group for the first time, and he's like, "Yeah, I pray with Islam, or pray with Muslims every Friday," and he has all the prayers memorized. And I remember thinking that's pretty remarkable, considering like I'm a Gen Xer, like the kind of culture I grew up in is extremely pejorative, right? And extremely pejorative. And I remember thinking that, like, how much I respected that, how much I valued that, and I wondered how hard that would be for other Latter-day Saints to accept a Latter-day Saint praying with Muslims. And so, like this last semester, we have a small handful of Muslim students at BYU, and I decided to show up. Right, I just decided that I would go, and I tried to be appropriate when I went, and I took off my shoes, I wore the right clothing, and I prayed with them. And there's this like really small minority of students who are most faithful people you've ever met, the kindest. We mainly have like Jordanian and Egyptian Muslim students. And so I went in there, and I've been praying with them as many times as I can every Friday when possible. And like accepting the massive difference between Latter-day Saints and Islam was culturally for me like a massive chasm. And then to find out that these are like the hospitality that they offered me when I showed up. Wow. When they saw me take off my shoes, I felt like Moses, and like taking off my shoes and showing the respect and value that their prayer practices deserve. Yeah. It's brought so much peace and important reflection on my own Latter-day Saint beliefs, and it was because probably the group that was the most different than me, I decided that they were valuable enough to show up, and now I know them, and they're these brilliant people. Like the blessing that it is to have them on BYU campus is immeasurable, and so like I think that like changing my heart probably that's a great question, and it really has. It's made a difference in my life.
I can only imagine they feel honored and appreciative of your participation and support of them when they do feel. It's very easy when you're the isolated minority to feel like nobody cares, nobody understands, nobody appreciates
when
us.
You're 12 among 36,000, you can imagine. And but I mean, maybe that's how I thought. But I like Jamie Smith's comment. You know, he talks about hospitality, and he sends students to a soup kitchen in the inner city, and they're hoping to show hospitality. But the response is they went to their home and found the hospitality there. I would express that as my reality is like, even if I did feel like I was being good to go there, the reality is how much they were welcoming and hopeful, and that hospitality was on their side. It wasn't me blessing them, it was them blessing me. And I think that's the most remarkable part about the experience.
And you know what's interesting? Again, I just think the contrast is profound, and I think it begs to be shared that, you know, when we go outside of our culture to share the good news of our belief system, either on a mission or just in a casual conversation, if we're in Egypt, or if we're in India, or if we're in China, or if we're in Japan, and we have a conversation with a person, do we just kind of say, oh, I hear you're a Hindu, and do you know that you're that's a false belief, and you're going to hell, and you're going to be damned by God? I mean, is that how anybody would talk to a perfectly normal stranger? No, you'd say, oh, wow, you know, I'd love to hear about your faith, and tell me what you believe, and oh, I'd like to ask you a couple questions. And we would do that almost normally. We would just do it kind of in a natural kind of engagement. And then we come back to our own culture, we engage people that are theologically different than us or spiritually different to us. We immediately take a different posture, like it's, you know, it's I have to argue with you, I have to debate with you, I have to contend with you, and yet I think, you know, the missionary mindset, which we sometimes call being just missional or incarnational. Jesus came down from heaven and took on human flesh to be relatable to us, to understand us. I mean, talk about leaving all the splendors of his deity to kind of be conformed to a time and a place and a body, a human body, where he had to get tired, and he had to go to the bathroom, and he had to eat food, and he had to drink water just to be sustained, because he really did embrace humanity, his own humanity. So, Jill, do you have a story?
Yeah, I think the one that I'm thinking of is just living in Utah County and being a very minority, and just my neighbor, and how she would come over and talk with me. And one of the things I noticed is that a lot of things would happen in our community without us being invited. There was, you know, the ladies would walk down the street with their baby strollers, and I had babies too, but I was never invited to walk with them, or they would have a party at the ward or something like that, and you just kind of felt like an outsider. I remember one time somebody coming to our door with a clipboard and saying, okay, are you a non-member? And so that's how they had referred to me, as this non-member. But I felt totally different with my next door neighbor, because we became friends.
Yeah.
And we had some great conversations. She would, you know, we had a lot of conversation about grace and works. And so I remember her coming to me and saying, hey, you know, we talked about grace in church today. And then we had this conversation about that. And then she would invite me when there were things that she was involved in, even if it was just at the church or with their children when they were being baptized, or different things happening with their kids. And so I loved that she just involved me in the different things that she was doing, simply because we were friends, and I learned a lot from that.
Yeah, that's a great example. You know, there's many in my mind that come to mind because of the years of involvement here, but just as recently and as simply as this comment was, we went up with Biola University, we went up to the Logan Institute. We had a wonderful session there. just engaging the students. Kurt, our campus contact there, and I kind of set it up, and we let them start talking. And then afterwards, they were doing what you said, taking pictures, getting each other's Instagram page and all that stuff, and sharing information. And then these 3 LDS young women came up to me, and they were kind of standing together, arm in arm, and they said, "Hey, are you the guy that brings these people to our institute?" And I said, "Well, I help them. Yeah, I'm that guy." And they all just said, "This was awesome. This was incredible. We've never done anything like this. Thank you for bringing them. We got to talk with them about Jesus." And I said, "You've just made my day." Because your enthusiasm, your excitement, it's oozing out of you, and you know that it was good to have a conversation about Jesus with somebody else. So, well, any final comments? Are we ready to go?
We're good.
Fantastic.
Okay. Well, Jill, do you want to say anything, or do you want me to wrap it up?
You're good to wrap it up.
Well, hey, thanks for checking out Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. We bring a new podcast every month, the first Tuesday of each month. We are always here with a new episode, so keep checking us out. Please, again, subscribe, check the notification bell, make comments, do what you do, share it with others, post it if you want to. This is something, and I'm really hoping that many of you BYU Institute students, as well as Biola, Westmont, APU, and Mobile, Alabama. We'd love to see you guys make comments, share your own experiences. Tell us if you were a part of the last couple years. Tell us how it has affected you. We even have a gal who was from Azusa Pacific now working with us, Kelsey Lean, and she actually moved from Alaska, has come to Utah, and she wants to live here and just live among the members of the Church of Jesus Christ, build friendships, and this is her passion, so very cool. But anyways, thanks for checking us out, and we will see you next time on Building Bridges with Greg and Jill. God bless.